Good evening and welcome to virtual Van Institute to our discussion with the prominent French-Turkish sociologist, Professor Nilüfer Göle, on the topic of the end of secularism, laïcité, the Hagia Sophia, and contemporary Euro-Islam. My name is Yochi Fischer, and this is an honor and pleasure for me to host today Professor Göle. Professor Göle is one of the leading sociologists working today. She's a professor at the École des études aux sciences sociales in Paris. She works on Islamic visibility, on secularism and intercultural controversies in European public spheres. Her book has been published in many languages, and I will mention just a few of them. She is the author of The Daily Lives of Muslims, Islam and Public Confrontation in Contemporary Europe. She wrote Islam and Secularity, the Future of Europe's Public Sphere, Islam and Public Controversy in Europe, and the Forbidden Modern Civilization Unveiling. Her current new program of research concerns public space movements, a new form of agency in global era. And she received the award Ambassador of the New Europe for her book, The Daily Lives of Muslims, and also the prize for the best book on Europe's future by European Solidarity Center at Gdansk. So good evening, Professor Göle.
Good evening, Yochi. Thank you.
I feel that the many years of friendship between you and the VanLeer Institute make this event as a part of an ongoing conversation, a conversation which accompanies our work here at the Institute and our thought about questions we will address today. Before we start, I would like to thank my colleagues from the VanLeer Institute who helped to coordinate and organize this event. Ido Harari, Daphne Schreiber, Sholomit Laron, Shira Wolfson-Brook, Tamar Abadi, Neri Lider, and Marina Sher. And towards the end of the conversation, we will have time for a few questions from the audience. So please feel free to write down your questions in the reply section of the YouTube or Facebook pages in which you are watching, and we will do our best to address them. So let's start. And if I may, I wanted to start with a personal question pertaining to your particular position in relation to your research. You are currently in Istanbul and you work in Paris. You are both Turkish and French, and you conduct research in these two important cultures. And I want to ask you about this mixture and whether you feel it provides you with a particular perspective on questions of Islam and secularism in Europe.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure for me to be back at VanLeer, even virtually. I profited a lot from our conversations with my colleagues there. Your question is very, it touches me profoundly as a researcher, but also as a person. At the time being, the two countries doesn't share a lot of sympathy for each other. So it's not always easy to be in these both countries. But they both have very strong traditions of state, central state, attachment to republicanism in both cases, and also with a very important secular tradition. For a Muslim majority country, and Turkey has been one of the most radically secularist country among Muslim countries. And we know French also, the French republicanism so much related with laïcité. One another thing also that links these two countries is the word laïcité is used widely, as you know, in Turkish, adapted to the Turkish language, laiklik. So these are the links, but of course, these are very different countries in terms of their historical trajectories, state formation, and secularism. But most importantly, what made my research relevant is I have worked on Islamic veiling and Turkish secularism in the 1980s. And it helped me to understand the encounter of the French Republic with the Islamic presence coming from migrants. So the anthropological, let's say, structure of societies are very different, Muslim majority and migrant Muslims. But in a way, these two strong state traditions with their attachment to the principle of secularism, laïcité, they had to deal with Islamic new claims of Islam in public life. So my experience as a researcher helped me to understand how, in the French case, the new configurations, the new changes, the new adaptations of laïcité in the face of Islam was taking place. Well, first, a note here, because we are always used to learn from the Western experiences, because we always see our history in the mirror of the West. So in the Turkish case, for instance, colleagues and researchers were always saying the Turkish laïcité is never a correct one. There's always a deficiency when you compare it with the French one. You can never reach. So there's always this model, ideal model, and you are deficient in relation to that. What happened in the 1990s is just the other way around. It is through the Turkish case that I was able to understand the French one. But of course, there are lots of resistances. It's so hard for the French also to see their own their own present in the mirror of another country, especially Muslim majority country. So that resistance is interesting. But what I singled out, let's say, from the Turkish secularism encountering the claims of Islam in relation to French case is first the nature of secularism as being didactic. There is a kind of didactic secularism. It's not only about the separation of the state and religion, it's also about ways of life, how you define a good way of life, and how you define a good citizen. So it concerns norms and values to be held in the public life. So that's what I call didactic secularism. Some would call it also related with the vector of colonialism in other contexts, like in India. In the Turkish case, it was a voluntary adoption of the secularism, which meant modernization, that meant westernization at that moment in the beginning of the foundation of the Republic in the 1920s. So we had to adopt the style of the westernized style of living, being in the public life. So there is this the didactic, how you teach people to be a good Western person. I mean, this was the contribution from my Turkish research area. The second one was the importance of the women's issue, because I have realized from the very beginning that the question of women was at the center of these debates before even the Republic, because they were the holders of the religious or conservative values. So for women to go out into the public life, to get into social mixity with men, to have professional life, education, go visiting a doctor, all these areas mattered a lot to define secularism. So this was the different things. In the third thing, I would say, is until now, after 30 years of trying to communicate what means the claims of covering Islamic dress for these women, their subjectivities, I think we failed. I have never understood the degree to which the covering of Muslim women, the readoption of the veil, the headscarf, provoked a deep anxiety in the psyche of secular women, how they felt threatened, or, I mean, the effects were or angry. So the effects, I couldn't understand. I have realized it in the Turkish case, but now I still continue to face that anger and fear in both countries. That's some aspect, the effects that Islamic presence triggers from the very beginning is still intriguing me.
Thank you. So I want to ask you about controversies. And it is common to hear today from many political, religious, and cultural directions and in various societies, accusations of blasphemy. And these accusations are directed directed at leaders, at cultural figures, artists, and protesters. So we have heard this, of course, in the context of the cartoons of Charlie Hebdo and the recent murder of the teacher Samuel Paty near Paris. But at the same time, we hear that from UNESCO personnel who are worried about the artistic treasures in Hagia Sophia and see the covering of these treasures as a form of blasphemy. So it sometimes seems that we live in an era in which religious and secular sacredness are equally challenged. And your work for many years has dealt with these questions of mutual claims between Muslims and secularists, which you conceptualize as controversies. And I refer here to your research on veiling, as you mentioned, on ritual slaughtering and on the cartoons, of course. And I want to ask you, what power do you see in this concept as a research tool, and why and how can controversies be utilized as a tool for better understanding society?
Okay, let me focus on the European context, because the controversies around public visibility of Islam, I think, shaped the political scene of almost all European countries for a long time now. But the date that historically I will start from 1989, because I think we have the tools of analysis there. In 1989, we had two events. One is the fatwa of Ayatollah Khomeini, issued against the British, Indian origin British author Salman Rushdie for his book Satanic Verses as a blasphemy. I think we should think of the cartoon, I would say tragedy now, not only a controversy turned into a tragedy. So from beginning 1989, there is of course, relation between the two, we forget. So the first appearance of Islamic presence in Europe, we had these two events. One, the fatwa, which created a shock among, of course, British intellectuals, writers, but among all European, of course, milieu. We didn't understand how to interpret it, because it was coming also from outside the country. And secondly, it is the same date, 1989, we had the first debate on l'affaire du foulard, that is the young girls who claimed to cover their heads in a French school at Creil. So this is the same date. So we have this, I would say, simultaneous happening or co-appearance of Islam in the European public sphere. Well, first, people didn't think about these together, but there is something to think together. First, we see it's European, it's British, it's French, and then it became also Danish cartoons and other parts of the world. So I think first, the controversy helps us to have a broader look, not national, but also European, because it's public space. And these controversies also travel from one place to another. They repeat themselves. Some of them remain local and national. Others become European in other contexts. So what was, I think, very difficult, these two different appearances or manifestation of Islam in the European public sphere are very different in nature. So one is related with ordinary practices, religious practices of Muslim citizens in Europe. There is a series of that. That is veiling practices, dietary habits, halal, like kosher, with ritual slaughtering, praying, and also having a sense of sacred. So this is one, I would say, all practices in everyday life. And those people are trying to be part of the public life. But the other one is related with violence. And it is, I don't know how to name it, global jihadism, because it's not always inborn. It can be issued from exterior, from another country. And so, and this, the violent character and the much more everyday life, ordinary practices, it's very important not to make the amalgam. So controversies normally helps us to understand what is happening, how to name this foreign religion, how to name these practices. Even for the headscarf, we didn't know how to semantically name it. Sometimes we call it headscarf, and now we call it veiling, hijab. So we tried to find some Arabic or Persian origins to have the meaning, or even burqa or burkini, which is a total, of course, invention. So that is, I think, controversy help us to understand as an interface, because there is something that is foreign, not desired, different kind of norms and practices, and we have to deal with it. So what is the frame? Frame is multiculturalism, minority rights. What is it? Secularism. We have these three things. So I think in the European context, the controversy is normally a tool to create familiarity and to include the other. But in a way, we failed. I mean, we all failed in these countries, because the controversy didn't help getting closer if we take each controversy. But in 30 years, on the contrary, it created more fracture. So that's why, for me, the controversy was a tool to understand the interface, because Muslims are becoming part of the European society. They are part of the European social fabric. And how to find words and frames to understand and to understand their own subjectivities and to find a place in the European public life, in European policy. It is not evident because, the religion is, considered in European secularism as something that should be in the head or in the private. Whereas Islamic religion, as the Jewish one, is a public religion, and it is embodied practices. So these people, if they want to follow their religion, they also cover themselves. They follow some of the dietary habits, and they try to be faithful to their religion in their everyday life. But now there is this amalgam that people wanted to avoid, confusion, that each sign of religiosity is looked as with suspicion, because they can become radical and they can create these terrible acts of violence and horror.
Okay, with your permission, I would like to focus on laïcité, which you mentioned, on French secularism, which is often presented also in Israel as a desirable and successful model for separation of religion and state. However, as we know from your studies and from the studies of Jose Casanova and Charles Taylor and others, it is a particular model that was constructed in a specific context, the context of Catholic Christianity. And what is happening to this model now? How does it function in its encounter with Islam? And has the laïcité changed, and in what manner?
Well, I think it is still an ongoing process. There is a battle how to reinterpret French secularism, French laïcité, in a more prescriptive way with prohibitions, and or in a more inclusive way. It's still, even at the level of the French state and government, there are these debates. So I don't think it is settled. But if we follow the signs, I think that we go towards a much more rigid secularism or authoritarian. So there is this not only didactic, but more and more authoritarian and prohibitions, prescriptive secularism. Well, there are these, what makes me to say that, the two laws that prohibited the religious signs in public schools. There was a big debate which religious signs should be prohibited, but we knew that in time it is called the headscarf ban, 2005. There was a big debate in 2005. And what is ostentatious? So what is ostentatious is already because you are in a culture that you see that the headscarf becomes ostentatious, but carrying a cross is ostentatious. So it's all about intercultural, of course, relations. When you are a minority, if you have a headscarf, it seems as ostentatious. So this is an interesting term because that helps us to understand what seems disturbing as foreign. And second law was 2010. One is 2004, the other one 2010. It was against the face veiling or total veiling. And there it was called public space. Because I knew from the beginning this was a concern of public space, as I said from my research. But many of my colleagues were saying, no, this is only about the public school, public institutions. Now we have this prohibition with law. So the solution they have found, it was prohibition in the name of secularism. So I think second thing about how the French laïcité was taking place or repositioning itself in relation to Islam by laws. So that's important, you know. And secondly, the debate. The debate became, if we think a little bit retrospectively, there was all this debate on multiculturalism. And French was never very keen on multiculturalism. It was more in Anglo-Saxon societies. And then we have observed that almost each of the countries, starting from Netherlands, but also Great Britain, places of multiculturalism, they said, and Germany, this is the end of multiculturalism. So how you're going to frame Islamic difference? So multiculturalism was no longer on the agenda. The French secularism, so I don't think we should think of it only as an exception to France, but France is more advanced in that experience, maybe, in front line. But the other countries follow more and more the secular values of their nation. So I don't think French secularism is an exception. Instead of, I mean, as multiculturalism retreated or didn't work, then the secularism took over. That's how I will think about it. But secularism, as I said, as a system of values, not as a tool for organization of religious pluralism or all kinds of pluralism among opinions, including atheism and so on, but rather how to give a hierarchy between values. So when there is each time there is a debate on Islam, it became a societal debate. For instance, I make it very easy. Islamic veiling, is it a right of minority religious group? No, because it is not in conformity with gender equality, with feminism. So it is defined as a secular value. It is one of the most important pillars of secularism as gender equality. Or ritual slaughtering. That is important because it also brought the Jewish community into the debate, because ritual slaughtering has been recognized as an exception for the Jewish community. And in the case of the Islamic debate, the recent controversy, the ritual slaughtering and halal became a societal debate. What it means, societal debate? This is against the animal rights because it is inflicting suffering to animals. So it should be prohibited. So you see, it is not in terms of minority rights. It is not in terms of multiculturalism. Let's recognize some exceptions to different groups, but it became a societal debate. So we have to reiterate, reinforce the values, and then this is the only way, that is the Republican secularist values, and others should be aligned with those values. So there was not so much place for controversy and for debating. That's what I mean. So secularism is used more as giving a kind of hierarchy or redefining the values of the Republic. That is, gender equality is one of them and others. So that is the most important change, I think, in terms of the shift of the meaning of secularism today. To finish with it, that means, because secularism is defined as, so many philosophers said, in relation to a particular religion, that is Christianity. But today it is defining itself in relation to a foreign religion, that is Islam. But again, in the Turkish case, secularism is defined in relation to Islam, all right, because they were obliged. So Atatürk is Muslim secularism. Like we say in the French, laïcité is catho-laïcité. The Turkish case is Muslim secularism, because Atatürk thought from the beginning the question was about women's visibility, women's participation to life, no Sharia law, and the evolution of Khalifa and things that you know.
So I want to elaborate a little bit about Muslim immigration and the relationship between Muslim immigration and the secular republic. So it is interesting to think of a comparison with the Israeli case, because in Israel, which absorbed a very large number of immigrants attempted initially to adopt a melting pot policy. After a few decades, it realized that this model was not working and allowed people to shape and choose for themselves their identity while adopting a kind of social model of multiple identities. In contrast, France, as it seems, insists in relation to its Muslim immigrants or population that they either change and become like us, or that they remain foreigners and hence a challenge or a threat. And recently, after the murder of the teacher Paty, Macron said that, and I quote, "We must reoccupy the living space occupied by Islam," end of quote. So can you expand on the encounter of French secularism with Islam? How do you see this encounter between the Republic and its values and the Muslim immigrants, and I'm speaking here about the immigrants, and what went wrong? So, or maybe in the first place, this encounter had no chance of working.
Yeah, I think that's what I'm trying to say. There is no today frame that helps to include the religious difference, and the fact that the violent acts also played a very, of course, devastating, destructive role in French society, but also in other parts of the world. Because if we go back to the cartoons, it started in 2005 in Copenhagen, and then it was reproduced, and then we had the massacre of Charlie Hebdo and Hyper Kosher in Paris in 2015. And then now 2020, as you remind, the beheading, the murder of the French teacher Samuel Paty. These are very traumatic events. So it is very difficult today to distinguish between these acts and the fact that the Muslim migrant population wants to live their religion and wants to be part of the polis, wants to be part of the public life. So I think what is hard is to distinguish these two things. And it was several times repeated in France with good intention. We will not make the amalgam, that is the confusion, the identification between these two acts. But in time, I think there is this problem because each sign is considered as a source of radicalization. Those social scientists who spoke about radicalization, I think, won ideologically the debate. I do not think that we should see religious signs, a religious presence as radicalization. These are two different logic of action. But now in France, also there is this new concept that is introduced by President Macron as separatism. That is separatism. That is, instead of communitarianism, which is considered as an Anglo-Saxon way of organizing differences by communities, because French Republic requires the individuals to be part of the state, part of the society. They do not want any community. This is why the multiculturalism never worked. But now the idea of separatism that I feel quite, I'm rather critical and not convinced at all, is a way of signaling out any kind of religious behavior, even starting maybe from not shaking hands or Islamic veiling, ritual slaughtering. Does this mean that they do not make part of the Republican values? So I think we are facing a rather vertical, that is imposing a national community, values of a majority, and requiring alignment with the values as they are defined by the state. So my work is, on the contrary, if I speak about controversy, it opens up the possibility for debating, borrowings, elaborations, accommodations between the two. And in real life, the accommodations are taking place. But the rhetoric, the political rhetoric, for me is not adapted, in my own view, is not adapted. We cannot consider every manifestation, appearance of religious practices and differences as separatism from the national community. So that's a very, I would say, very authoritarian move. But we'll see how they will evolve.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of communities and separation, I want to ask you about anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. Do you see any similarities between the attitudes of the Eichite towards Islam and its attitudes towards Judaism? And beyond that, to what extent do you see a connection between Islamophobia in Europe and past and contemporary anti-Semitic trends?
I do think we should bring more layers to that comparison. We shouldn't make a shortcut comparison through victimization, or like these are all stemming from racism, and either it manifests itself as anti-Semitism or Islamophobia. This is the European Western legacy. I don't think we should be trapped in that kind of simplistic comparison. And also, I'm very, again, intrigued by the fact that in many places, the word Islamophobia, even in France, is criticized because, according to some, if you use the word Islamophobia, you avoid any criticism towards Islam. So it shouldn't be used. So Islamophobia is even as a word, as a concept, is a battleground today. Whereas anti-Semitism, at least for some time, was more, because of all the things that have happened, was more accepted in a way in history. But what is more, I think, what requires comparison is, to me, is again going back to the controversies. Because the controversies, as I told you, brought in the Jewish population living in Europe today, and they don't want to be involved with all that, okay? They don't want to be involved. They have already paid a very important price, tribute, and they don't want to be involved with these. But it is inescapable. That is, when ritual slaughtering is considered as a barbaric act, Jewish community reacted. And then another controversy that also brought together Jews and Muslims, in spite of their will, is the circumcision of young boys in Germany. They have forgotten suddenly the past in Germany. They have forgotten that this practice was also very important for being part of the religious community for Jews. And so they have also they have tried to create a law to prohibit the circumcision of young boys. And the arguments was again related with the integrity of young boys, the body integrity. So it is what I think Shai Levi called a new humanist ethic. So how the new humanist ethic also is put forward, it's very much related with secular humanist ethic, in the name of protecting the child, but also intervening in the private life, also in the relation between the family and the child. Because if you prohibit the circumcision, of course, it's a very intimate family matter, transmission from the parents, from the father to the child, and so on. So these two, for instance, controversies, they are very revealing the relations between Jewish and Muslim practices, but also those who are living today. So I think the learning from the ways in which Jewish religion is accepted, became a religion in Europe, is very important for Muslims. So what I want to say is Muslims have to learn from the past experience of Judaism before Holocaust, because there has been all these very close linked debates on ritual slaughtering. I don't know why, but the issue of women's veiling didn't come up. But these were discussed. And again, this was a different religion from Christianity. So they tried to deal with it. So whereas we put Muslims in front of the choice, you have to accept Holocaust. And they are answering, we are not responsible of it. But they have to, I do agree, they have to understand the way to make it more familiar for them is to go back to the period pre-Holocaust and to understand how Judaism became part of religion. So they have to learn from the past. And I think Jews has to learn, living in Europe, has to be involved and concerned with these controversies in the present. So there is this temporary element that is important. And I think the link between it will be very important to create that conversation, the mutual learning, not to be totally closed down in a binary and vertical opposition between Muslims and the state. It should be a more open phenomena between different religious groups and civil societal associations and whatever. That's how I see anti-Semitism and Islamophobia.
Thank you. And I would like to move on to Turkey. And recently there's been tense exchanges and tension between Macron and Erdogan, representing secularism and Islam respectively. To what extent do you think that Erdogan's struggle with the laïcité can be seen as a part of the struggle against the legacy of Atatürk and the Turkish form of secularism, like clique, which you mentioned? This, of course, relates to the question of turning museums to mosques or turning them back into mosques. And the Hagia Sophia is the most famous case, but certainly not the only one. So how do you see these changes? How is all this perceived in Turkey?
First of all, again, a very, very short history, but I remembered during the first debate and uprisings of cartoon publications of cartoons in a Copenhagen newspaper. This was the first moment of uprisings and protests among the Muslim world. Zapatero, the French primary minister, and at that time, and Erdogan, also prime minister at that time, they came together. They have signed a letter or a petition, whatever, to calm down the cartoon reactions in the world, to develop the mutual understanding. And they launched at that time, 2005, Alliance des Civilisations, civilizational alliance between civilizations. Now, this was in 2005. You see how things changed radically. 2005, Turkey was still believing that this long process of westernization that started with the end of Ottoman Empire, that continued with a lot of engagement and zealous Turkish Republican nationalism during the Republic, normally should have come to an end with the European Union. So in the eyes of the Turkish people, their place was in Europe, and they have done, it's not only European Union, it started before, well before the European Union. So first, that was a big frustration, because Turkish, now it is so far away, membership even was considered to be totally irrelevant, illegal, or, I mean, unwanted by European countries and societies, and not legitimate, okay? So I come back to that because I still believe that it was an important moment, opportunity to create Euro-Islam on a different also, at a different level, not only within European countries, but also a different relationship with Turkey and Europe would have created a maybe more peaceful atmosphere between the two. Because if you compare that time, nobody remembers today that letter signed by Zapatero and Erdogan, but I do, because I was working on the controversies. So that's also the ruse or trick key of history. We don't know what are the good gestures or moves or practices that are kept, that are kept in our memory and reproduced, and what are the words and themes that are totally forgotten. So this is forgotten. That means something. So now the same Erdogan is totally on a different rhetoric. I'm not. So somebody would have said, well, he was from the beginning. I don't believe in that kind of things. But just objectively speaking, today Europe and Turkey is just not only going away, but has a more confrontational, indeed, discourse. So what happened in Turkey with Hagia Sophia now is, of course, a very important symbolically, but beyond that, move. Some people would say it's a political move because Erdogan is losing his popularity. So it's more a kind of political instrumental gesture. I don't think so, because this has been a very important, again, controversy in Turkey, because Hagia Sophia, we have different narratives on monuments are very important. Monuments is the carriers of memory, long time memory, but also each time in the present, we give them a meaning. They are markers of power, identity. Hagia Sophia is one of the most important, of course, monuments of Eastern Christianity, Byzantium legacy in Turkey. And it is also, of course, the conversion of the Church of Hagia Sophia in 1453 with the conquest of Constantinople by Ottoman Empire is a very important date in the memory of the Turkish population. They still, well, again, this is religious secular divide, because I am coming from a secular background. So I thought the reconversion of the museum and the mosque as a museum, of course, it was a very important move by Atatürk in 1934 as a secular gesture. Okay, that's our narrative. The narrative of the religious conservative people is, on the contrary, Turkish Muslims were taken from their, there's a poet who, Necip Fazıl Kısakürek, very well-known poet among especially conservative people. And he was very influential. He was saying Hagia Sophia is not just a mosque, but also it's the original spirit of the Turk. This is to see to what extent for Turkish people, some conservative people, so it is closure to Islamic praying meant the captivity of this spirit. So they were fighting to get it back. And also it was like a kind of concession to the West, which meant giving from their own spirit. So first, I want to say there are competing narratives, even within Turkey. Whereas for the secular Turks, it is just really betraying the Atatürk's legacy. So that move has several meanings. It cannot be taken only in instrumental terms. And it is basically also a kind of anti-Western stand, that's for sure. So the Turkish political system with Erdogan trying to rebuild in a process of nation building with a more populist Islamic background. So it's not the nostalgia of the Ottoman past. It is trying to rewrite nationalism in antithesis with Atatürk. So that's why it's so, you see, loaded with layers of interpretation. For me, I think what is sad is again, we should go beyond the binary opposition. Either it is a church or a museum, because it has been already during the Ottoman Empire, because it is the imperial mosque. So the Ottomans, the sultans, gave a lot of value and prestige to the Hagia Sophia. And they tried to make their own. They appropriated it with the creation of myths, also texts, historical texts. And so it was not like a gesture of taking it and destroying, but making it live even more and protect it. It became part of for the prestige of the Ottoman Empire. So it depends how you reappropriate the monument. So it is thought in the West sometimes, so there will be iconoclasm. That's not true. I mean, all the images in different periods, the question of image, even in Byzantium culture, it was quite controversial also. So we shouldn't, again, simplify. But what happened for me is the denial of the Eastern Christianity for the Turkish legacy. What I find is with the political Islam, everything is West. So it is erasure of history. It is flattening of history. Which history? The Eastern Christianity. It's not only about the Western Christianity, but the Ottoman Empire had this Byzantium legacy, which really transformed the whole architecture of mosques. Sinan took from the dome of Hagia Sophia. So the aesthetics are very important. The forms are important. So the Turkish mosques are very much inspired by Hagia Sophia dome and the minares that were put by Sinan. So I believe in this as it's not only pluralism among actors, but also this multi-directional memories, and keep bringing back the layers of this history. So Turkey could have contributed to the richness of Hagia Sophia, and they can still. It is not because it became a mosque that it will be totally forgotten. It depends how you use the space. But I think it will be very important not to the political ideologies is like Western Christianity, the West and Christianity. What you do with Eastern Christianity, which is on your land.
Yeah, thank you. Your current research is on new forms of agency in a global era. And you have spoken and wrote a lot about the meaning of and importance of visibility. And following the previous question, I wanted to ask you more generally about public space. And recently, here in Israel, during the COVID-19 period, we have seen more and more people active politically in the streets, going out from behind the keyboards to the squares in order to demonstrate, to be with each other and to confront the ruling power. So and this is not just an Israeli case, of course. So we see demonstrators all over the world. So how do you explain this phenomenon of returning to the streets? Or more generally, what is the role of public space in the democratic culture of the 21st century?
Yeah, thank you for this question, because I think we all experienced with the pandemic a society without a public space, our lives without a public space, what it looks like, even as an individual, how you become a person if you do not have any access to your working place, to your praying places, to your friends, to restaurants, to culture, anything. What is public? What is a life? Can we have a society without public space? I think it is we all experienced at the level of the planet. And we have seen to what extent it is not possible. Democracy depends on the public space. And of course, you would say, we know it from the Greek democracy with agoras. But in the contemporary world, public space doesn't exist as before. We don't have any space. I mean, either it is totally under the surveillance of state, as Agamben would call all state of exception all the time, we are all surveyed, or it is totally under the privatization, controlled, and we don't have free spaces, no empty space. So what happened is with Black Lives Matter, we were at the really in the midst of lockdown, and people came to the streets. So it's not the same kind of agency like trade union movements, feminist movements, identity movements, nationalist, ethnical movements. It's all citizens, and they are claiming for public space, as in the case of Black Lives Matter, breathing space. I think breathing is so important. That's the first freedom. We need to breathe and to be together. I think it also shows us that individualism that really was imposed by this modernity notions is coming to its limits, because look what we have lived with pandemic. Individualism is not a solution. On the contrary, you need to depend on the other. Your life depends on the other. So it's not sufficient to just to have your mask. So this the cooperation between individuals, the solidarity between individuals become very important. That's what I have observed in all these public space occupation movements. Even les Gilets jaunes in France, it's again the visibility. They brought to our consciousness in a country like France that we idealize the little towns with, all these coffee houses, beautiful leisure time, culture. No, there were periphery of these little cities where there was nothing. Even in order to go for work, they had to take their car so far away. That's why they had to pay so much for the essence. That's why they started for the Gilets jaunes. They didn't have any leisure culture. They didn't have any services, health services, educational services. So I think it was so revealing. We suddenly, with their movement, Gilets jaunes, we became aware that there was another France. So they brought visibility, again, of those forgotten segments of society, but it's also related with how we organize the space, the city life. So I really believe that there is no democracy without thinking about the forms, aesthetic forms, spatial forms, and the way we are related to each other, the forms of civility even. So that's why I believe really that we have to reclaim public space and as a space, not metaphorically. And even now we are in the virtual space, at least we have that. But I do believe that we need to create these places. This is the only way to be in a free and in a society where we can meet with each other and bring new things together.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Before we conclude and take some questions from the audience, I want to ask you to return to the question of secularism. And the title of this conversation suggests that we might have reached the end of the age of secularism. Secularism is facing a global crisis. Some in France and elsewhere in Europe think that secularism is in crisis precisely because we, the secularists, were not faithful enough to our values. And from the other direction, there are claims that it is in a crisis because it was based from the outset on injustice and unacceptance of other ways of life. So from your perspective, how do you analyze this dilemma and how do you see the future of secularism?
I wouldn't speak about crisis, but I would ask the question, is secularism still relevant for all of us? Is it relevant or not? I don't know. I still want to live under secular law. For me personally, yes, but as a sociologist, I'm also asking what it means, secularism, for plurality of cultures. Today, we are all living in plural cultures. We are refusing multiculturalism, refusing in the sense that we think it's the end, it doesn't work, and so on. But we are in multicultural societies more and more. So what is the best tool to keep this together? So secularism was taught as a tool of organization of religious plurality, especially when you look at India, for instance. That is also the contribution of Indians to the understanding of secularism. But at the same time, it means today as imposing the hegemony of the values of the West. So the question is there any, the model of emancipation and pluralism, do we have just a single model of emancipation for persons, individuals, that is going away from religion? That is the model of emancipation, secular emancipation and pluralism. Is that the only model? And if this model becomes, because it evolves, as we say, it is changing, and if it becomes only a tool for reinforcement of values of the Western experience against the others, imposing its own values, then it will totally lose its relevance. That's what so we have two questions. How can it be relevant again? And the only way, maybe it's not only question, this is a conditional, is to understand other particularities as maybe elaborating a model of emancipation and pluralism, which is not identical with the ways in which the Western societies elaborated. So I think it should be open to learning from others. Otherwise, it won't be relevant.
Yeah. Thank you. We can now move on to some questions from the audience. And let me begin with Karim Aish. Is asking if secularism is linked to religious extremists, what criteria are used to classify which religion is included in secularism?
If I understood well, I'm not sure because I didn't understand extremism question, but secularism is always related with, of course, the majority religion in which they develop. But the issue is how to involve, how to include other religions each time. So I think it depends on the countries. So in the case of Turkey, it was much more Sunnite religious definition, and it was not maybe enough pluralistic in terms of religious inclusions, but it was, if we consider the Ottoman Empire and multi-ethnicity, it was much more pluralistic in a way. So it depends on the different historical trajectories.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And Ifat Ben-Dro is asking, how, in your opinion, does the majority of the religious Turkish public accept Erdogan's attempts to erase the legacy of Atatürk? And do you think that those who don't support him can translate their power to electoral power?
That's a difficult question. I don't know. Turkey is not, I mean, there is this coming back of Atatürk legacy, even in the 80s. So before we used to speak about Kemalism as an ideology, which is more related with Atatürk and military power. In the 1980s, Atatürk became more and more a civil figure. You can find the pictures of Atatürk and everything, even in the shops and in the houses and so on. So I think there is a lot of rejuvenation of Atatürk in Turkey. So it's not like one becoming and then the other is totally forgotten. But with that, because when you look at the elections, it's 50% also, which doesn't go in towards Erdogan, and it shouldn't be thought only as a religious vote. Besides, it's a much more complicated phenomena. But would that part of Turkey can be organized and turn it into a vote? I think it already started a little bit with the municipalities and things. So it's getting more pluralistic a little bit more, but we have still a lot of problems of freedom of expression in public space. So the universities, media, people are in jail, and so we still have a way to go.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Göle, for a fascinating and insightful talk. And indeed, the double perspective you present, and with which we began our conversation, a perspective considering Islam, Europe, and the public spaces we all share, from both inside and outside, offers fascinating political and cultural observations that allow us to see beyond simplistic dichotomies. And I think that approaches such as yours that incorporate an in-depth analysis of the religious and political fields together with a sensitive observation of the challenges of contemporary situation are very rare. So I'm very happy and grateful for the opportunity we had to speak and learn from you today. And I hope we will soon have the chance to continue our conversation face-to-face in the public space in Jerusalem, in Paris, and Istanbul, or somewhere else. Thank you very much.
I thank you very much. It was a real pleasure to find you.